background, my name is Sahdev from ODRL. We work in the areas of transformational change, culture change, and talent assessment and development. So this session is really about sharing with you some observations, experiences that we've had in designing and delivering culture change programs within organizations. And I'll share with you a specific case study as part of the discussion today. Now, in terms of organizational cultures, how we define the culture of organizations, that's an interesting concept in itself. It is actually the most important part of an organization, in my view. The reason I say that, it is not often explicitly described, but it is actually something that influences behavior. It influences the way people interact with each other, the results they deliver, the general climate that's generated as a consequence of organizational culture. Now, to take all of that into account, it is actually, the best way to describe it is the way things are done around here. So what gets acknowledged, what gets recognized, what gets frowned upon is all about the organizational culture itself. Now, why do we consider the importance of organizational culture in terms of an organization's capacity to deliver what it is supposed to deliver? Now, there is vast literature, there are innumerable research studies that actually establish the link between organizational culture and performance. So there is a direct correlation between the two. And quite often we've asked this question in terms of what comes first. Does performance come first or does culture come first? Now, the reality is that culture actually dictates or influences performance of organizations. And therefore, it is absolutely critical to take the cultural context into account both in terms of change, but in terms of the day-to-day operations as well. Now, in implementing change, we find that there are some statistics that are not actually very positive. You find that 70% of change programs actually don't deliver what they're supposed to deliver. Now, the reason for that, quite often, if you unpack the layers and see what actually gets in the way of organizations benefiting from change programs, is that they don't actually focus on culture change that needs to be aligned with the changes that actually are being implemented. So that's a critical aspect of the whole thing. And of course, using a little bit of the cliche that culture can eat strategy for breakfast. So you can have the best strategy, the best structure, but if the culture is not aligned, you're not going to get the results. And again, you hear a lot in organizations about we need to be more innovative, we need to be more adaptable, we need to actually be flexible and responsive, et cetera, et cetera. However, if it is not accompanied with a culture that allows people to be more innovative, allows people to make mistakes, enables people to take more control over their working lives, you're not going to get those kind of results. So that kind of is the backdrop to it. And what I would do is to really give you an example of a culture change program that we were involved with. The reason I selected this one is it is an example of how things ought to be done. And this particular organization really took culture very seriously and went along with the whole process of changing the culture, but also ensuring that it is sustainable over time. So I thought a good positive experience, and we don't often come across a textbook example where you find that organizations have actually gone through the process in that way. So this is a very positive example, and I thought that would be a good one to share with you. The organization is a police force employing about 6,000 people. Actually, one of the top performing police forces in the country. However, the aspiration was to say, right, okay, we are pretty good at what we do, but how do we sustain that? And how do we ensure that we are constantly questioning ourselves to improve, to enhance our effectiveness, to really stretch the boundaries in terms of what we can and can't, what we can in terms of delivering to the citizens. So there was that drive to really look at, explore ways of stretching those boundaries as part of the day-to-day practices. And there was a significant amount of apprehension in terms of looking at culture to begin with. And there was some history around this. And the history was that in the past, this particular organization had actually gone through a process of trying to understand its culture and had done quite a bit of work to get people to provide their perspectives. The results were actually quite damning. And so the leadership team at that point really felt that this is serious stuff. What are we going to do with it? This is too difficult to handle. So somehow it was not progressed in the way that it should have been progressed. So a few years down the line, the whole notion of culture came up again, and there was this apprehension because of that historical experience. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at developing that shared understanding of culture, what it means and why it is important for this particular force. So the approach that we actually adopted in terms of developing a methodology to understand the culture of the organization and then to look at ways and means of changing it where required. There was quite a bit of analysis that went into the process to really understand the context, to look at the everyday working lives of people through their eyes, to look at their sort of challenges and opportunities that they are faced with. Also to look at some of the macro level changes happening through government expectations, the stakeholders having a different expectation of the police forces generally. And of course, there's a drive for efficiency, effectiveness, the imperative in terms of reducing costs, no doubt in the public sector is very high, and the same applied for this particular force as well. The second aspect where we really felt that time was needed in terms of developing that leadership, a shared understanding amongst the leadership team in terms of their role in this culture change journey, as well as to get them to articulate the current culture, the extent to which it actually helps or inhibits the organization's capacity to deliver its goods and services, and the extent to which it needs to change. So quite a significant amount of time was spent with the leadership team to really have the team on the same page in terms of understanding, in terms of actually articulating the desired culture as well. And the third aspect was the staff engagement aspect. Now, this particular force, the uniqueness was they were very open to ideas, very open to suggestions, very keen to actually start engaging with people in the front line. And we spent an enormous amount of time spending time with people, shadowing them, understanding what their everyday working lives were like. So we conducted a whole range of focus groups, interviews, did some shadowing, to really develop that understanding of what the current cultural practices were and the extent to which this supported or got in the way of effectiveness. And this information, so the background, the analysis, and work with the leadership team, and also the qualitative work with employees, helped us to formulate some ideas in terms of the culture that exists right now, the extent to which it needs to change, and more importantly, how do we define that culture? How do we make it much more explicit as opposed to thinking about culture as an abstract kind of notion? Because that's quite important. So everyone in the organization understands that this is what we mean by culture, and this is what we are doing in order to actually enhance the culture of the organization. So based on that initial work, we developed an instrument to really look at how could we develop a baseline of this particular organization, to develop a baseline profile of its current culture, so we have the opportunity to track and monitor and review change over time. So that was kind of what came out of the qualitative work that we did initially, to develop a snapshot in terms of where the organization is right now and where does it want to be in the future. And there were three key themes that we felt defined the culture of the organization. And the three broad areas were people, performance, and partnerships. So the balance between the people aspects, the importance of partnerships, and performance. So how do we get all of those together to develop an understanding of the current and the desired culture? So the cultural profile that formed a central part of this process was then further defined to really get an understanding, because people is a broad sort of notion, performance is very broad, and so is partnership. So we kind of broke it down into different sort of dimensions. So, for example, under people, it is about putting people first. So what about the communities, people that they serve? Internally, also, valuing people was seen to be very central. And the third notion was about development of staff. So that under people were those three dimensions. Under performance, we looked at achieving results and accountability, two really important aspects in terms of creating that desired culture. So people having a clear understanding about what they need to do in terms of results and what are they accountable for. And the third dimension, which is partnerships, was both about working across within the organization with other functions, but also with other stakeholders externally. So the importance of that, was really felt to be, quite critical in terms of how the force actually operated. So the survey was then circulated across the organization, and we got the initial kind of snapshot in terms of what the culture was like at that point. And that provided tangible information, so from the qualitative information to a much more tangible, numbers-based profile that actually helps both, everyone in the organization to say, right, okay, if you're at point X here, we really need to do more work to, for example, to make us more accountable, and I'll come to that in a minute. So that was the initial piece of work. And what, if I was to look at, a snapshot, there were some real strengths in the force. There were great things happening in pockets of the organization. So one could describe that, it was good enough. Things were working pretty well for the force. You found examples of good practice, for example, very constructive leadership behaviors at the higher level. However, there was lack of consistency of leadership styles as you progressed within the organization, especially at the front line. So there were some pockets where there were excellent leaders, frontline leaders. In others, in other parts of the organization, you didn't find that. There was a sense of pride in working for the force. That was coming out quite clearly, and that was something that was a solid platform upon which to bring about culture change, because there was that commitment. And you find that in public service, in public sector organizations, you have that real sense of pride. People are very committed. It's the goodwill of people. And I think that was really quite important to share with people within the organization, and also to say, well, we can capitalize based on that in terms of really then bringing about culture change within the organization. Results orientated, there were some managers who were far more results orientated as opposed to being people orientated, so there was that aspect as well. So there were some strengths that were already identified, and then the opportunity in terms of what could be done differently or what could we do more of, that would shift the force towards that excellence part that they were looking to generate. So one of the issues that was quite clear was the internal partnership. So people working in silos, not having enough of that crossover understanding of what is happening elsewhere. Performance management was another aspect in terms of how do we distinguish high performers from average to poor performers. So what's the process? Celebrating success. A lot was taken for granted because lots of good things were happening every day, but there was no point in the organization where people actually stood back and said, well, I think, let's celebrate success. And they did that, actually. I'll come to that in a minute. Bureaucracy, a lot of bureaucracy, lack of discretion. People felt disempowered. They were not able to make those kind of decisions in the front line. People facing challenges were not able to make those, or were not empowered to make those decisions. So there was lack of discretion, and that was really important. And this is not just here. Lack of discretion is one of the key variables that actually affects job satisfaction and performance. So that is an important point, and the force actually did a lot of work in this area. So those were some of the high-level points coming out. So in terms of, this is again the detail, and I won't go through the detail of it. So the work that we actually did, the most important part of the process was to say, okay, so we've got all this information, so what? What do we do with this data? So our role was very much working in partnership with the force to help them to develop some tangible, practical action plans. Now, the way we did it, it was not something that we as external people would come and impose on the force. What we did was help them to establish an internal change team, and this change team was actually located both centrally and also within its sort of, within different parts of the county as well. So the ownership in terms of implementing change was very much internally driven with the support of the leadership team. And this is really important in terms of our own methodology and what works and what doesn't work. So change imposed by external firms is very temporary. For that to be sustainable, particularly culture change, it's got to be owned by people within the organization. So there was quite a bit of work that went into establishing that change team and really equipping them with change management tools and techniques so that they felt that they could go ahead and implement those actions. So this, a large part of the work in terms of our involvement was actually helping the force to understand, first of all, the desired culture, the actions, the communication issues, and then how do you mobilize the internal team to take ownership of the change process itself. We also had the opportunity to conduct a longitudinal study. So we did this at one point in the process, and the force then went ahead and started to implement the actions with our support from time to time, monitoring, reviewing, and providing some guidance. And then 18 months down the line, the whole process was reviewed. And this is why I said that this was really exciting, because not all organizations have that propensity or the commitment to really follow up on change itself. And this particular organization did it. So we had this great opportunity to conduct some longitudinal studies. So, for example, 18 months down the line, we went through a similar kind of process, conducting some qualitative studies, and also conducted the survey again to see what's the nature of change, the extent to which people feel that the culture is shifting in the right direction. So we did quite a bit of work. I just wanted to share with you some interesting data here. So if you look at this, for example, I believe that the public's priorities are the same as the organization's priorities, although more could have been done, but there was a shift in the right direction. And this is about saying, well, we need to communicate what your priorities are, and we focus our energy, considering we have limited resources, we focus our energies on what is most important to the public. So that was an interesting one. And here, adequate time to provide quality of service to the customer. Not that they started recruiting more people, but it's the way they organized themselves, the way teams were organized, that they were structured, that enabled them to free up a little bit more time. And then if I look at in another area, which is accountability, now here, some interesting results around leadership and management. I think, those were quite big shifts here. For example, leaders, managers are open to new ideas. So you had 58.1% 18 months ago, and there was a clear shift and there was a real drive to change management styles, leadership styles, with a view to actually empowering people and to enable people to suggest ideas, come up with innovation. And this was a big thing within the force. So they did invest quite significantly in frontline leadership. So there was consistency of leadership styles about greater empowerment and discretion. And here, so I have the freedom and given the authority to act in the organization's best interests. So there you see a shift as well. And I can, there's a lot of data, but obviously, I won't go through the whole thing. I mentioned about celebrating success and that the force was not very good at celebrating success. In fact, they took that quite seriously and they actually put in their diaries events on a regular basis where they got together to really celebrate success. And the first one was quite a big bang event, but subsequent to that, that became very much part of the culture. It's not to say that, it's a trite thing, we celebrate everything, but there are some important things that happen on an everyday basis. And I think it's important to take stock of those and celebrate success as well. Okay, so, right, okay. The other point I'd like to highlight here is I have a high level of influence in developing new working practices. Again, a shift in the right direction. Of course, a lot more can be done, but it's about the shift in the culture, really. Okay, so there's quite a lot of information that I could actually share with you, but just to really conclude in terms of some of the lessons learned or some of the observations, it is important if you're embarking on a culture change program to actually do so in an evidence-based manner, because culture can remain at a very abstract level. Now, the sponsorship from the leadership team is really important, and having that shared understanding amongst leaders in terms of what a change in culture will deliver and their role in it is absolutely critical. Engagement of staff, having them on board, having staff on board, because they know the problems, they have the solutions. And the other point is, of course, sustainable culture change, or any change really, requires the ownership of the internal staff members. It can't be done to them. So having structures, systems, and processes in place, it is hard work, but actually it can really deliver results. And in this case, we actually saw that happening over a period of time. So I just wanted to share that with you. Thank you. If you have any questions, thank you very much. Happy to take questions if you have any. Okay. It doesn't. Right, okay. You're done. Thank you. Thank you very much.